My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru. I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's webinar, we have scheduled for about 90 minutes in total, but we definitely want to hear from you. So you've already found the chat, which is fantastic. There are a few other tabs up there. So if you see the Q&A tab, that is where you can ask specific questions that you want Eric to answer at the end. So we will have a Q&A session at the end where you can ask those questions. Even if you don't have a question, go ahead and check out that Q&A section throughout the webinar because you can upvote each other's questions. So if there's a question that is particularly relevant to you, go ahead and like it or upvote it, and I'll try to use that to ask the most relevant questions towards the end. Go ahead and use the chat as well. You can feel free to ask each other questions. We don't monitor that as well because sometimes it moves a little bit fast for me, but the Q&A, I'll definitely keep that in mind, and we will focus on those towards the end. One other question we always get is, will this be recorded? Will this be shared? And the answer is yes. We will share the full recording, the slide with all registrants after the webinar. Keep an eye out for that email from us. It may be the day after, it may be later this week. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we even put on these free training sessions. So improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. And it's our mission for likely a lot of those of you who are here today. So we're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free webinars, partnering with world-class device experts like today's presenter, Eric Henry, or through our award-winning cloud-based solutions. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and helping them stay there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face is this is a heavily regulated industry, but our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru's MedTech suite provides quality management, product development, and clinical data management solutions, along with high-quality training and education designed exclusively for medical devices. So if you are interested in seeing why over 1,000 of the world's leading MedTech companies trust Greenlight Guru, head over to www.greenlight.guru. After the presentation, you can see a personalized demo. Okay, let me give you a proper introduction to your presenter. This is a unique opportunity. Eric is a 35-year industry veteran. He's led global technical and quality functions at some of the medical device industry's largest players. So now he's working for the law firm King & Spalding. Eric provides advisory and consulting services focusing on regulatory compliance, enforcement, and policy matters involving industries regulated by the FDA. He provides guidance to industry professionals on FDA requirements, including quality system requirements, inspection preparedness, and post-market obligations. Eric further advises corporate management and boards concerning their responsibilities and FDA expectations. Eric serves as a strategic committee member for the AI Global Health Initiative under AFDO RAPS sponsorship. He also co-leads the initiative GMLP working team and volunteers as an advisory board member and mentor to several industry-leading organizations. So with that, I'll let you take it away, Eric.
All right, I appreciate it, Etienne, and thanks everyone for coming to today's talk, especially for those of you that are watching this over your dinner hour in Western Europe or even later in other places. Really appreciate you taking the time. As Etienne said, my name is Eric Henry, and I work for the law firm of King & Spalding. Been there about 5 years or so. Actually, November will be 5 years after 30-something years in industry. But today we're going to talk a little bit about this overhaul of the quality system regulation 21 CFR Part 820 to align it with the ISO standard 1345-2016. I'm going to give a little bit of background first and tell you how we got to where we are, and then we'll walk through some of the specific structural changes in the proposed rule and what we can expect next as that rule moves through the rulemaking process into the final rule state, and then all of the things around it that need to support it are developed and released. So first of all, for those of you that may be new to the medical device industry or new to the U.S. regulation, Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 820, all of the Title 21 regulations within the U.S. Code are areas that are overseen by the Food and Drug Administration. and Part 820 is the quality system regulation. And it was put into place in 1997 to replace what were the good manufacturing practices that were established in 1978. And it was actually harmonized to an ISO 1345 standard then, to the 2003 version of it, or what became the 2003 version of it, although, obviously this was about 6 years earlier. But some of those draft documents and some of the draft language that came out of the earlier episodes fed 1997 quality system regulation. And there was a variety of reasons the FDA didn't do then what they're doing now, which is this basically including by reference the ISO standard. But as we're going to see later, they have adopted it more directly now. And some of those reasons had to do with the fact that in the U.S., regulatory documents such as this, guidance and regulations, are free to the public. And in the ISO world and the world of most other standards, these are copyrighted products that have to be purchased. And so that was a bit of the problem. There were a few other issues as well. But the scope of the quality system regulation, after all this was done in 1997, was for domestic and foreign manufacturers of finished medical devices. It did not include and does not include component manufacturers, although purchasing controls and supplier quality functions within those organizations might be applied to a component manufacturing site. It also applies to anything that's done in the design, manufacturing, packaging, labeling, storage, installation, servicing of the finished medical device. So as the regulation currently states, if you're doing some of those things, but not all of those things, then the things you're doing would have to comply with the quality system regulation where it works for you, where it applies to you. And it is for finished medical devices that are intended for marketing in the United States, as well as its territories, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. There's really just one big requirement in the quality system regulation in the U.S., the QSR, and that is that you have to have a quality system that is appropriate for a specific medical device that is designed or manufactured to make sure that it meets the requirements of 21 CFR Part 820. The one thing that I want to draw everyone's attention to is this last bullet, and I often come up on confusion with this word, especially when it shows up in enforcement actions and potential enforcement actions like warning letters and consent decrees and so on. And that's the use of the word adulterated. What the quality system regulation says specifically, as well as the statute, the law that it came from, is that if you don't comply with any element of the quality system regulation, your product is deemed as adulterated. And adulterated in the context of regulatory requirements doesn't mean that there's bugs in your soup. It doesn't mean that there's some contaminant or particle floating around in something. What it means simply is that you have failed to meet the regulatory requirements that are associated with the legal marketing of your product. And so I want to keep in mind that word as we move through this, but also as you think about how this might be enforced later on. Now, a very quick walk just for a couple of slides here, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. For those of you that aren't familiar with how the current Part 820 is structured, this is a quick overview, and those items with an asterisk beside them are items that are currently within the scope of the quality system inspection technique. And we'll talk more about that later, but this is the guide that the FDA investigators use when they come and inspect a site. They have a certain scope of activities they follow and things that they review. And you might ask, well, why don't they cover everything like an ISO auditor would do? And the answer to that question is because through these mechanisms, through these parts of the regulation, they can get to all the other parts. So they look at these, but they'll have elements within those that allow them access to other parts of the regulation as applicable. So all the management control places, this is where you have things like internal audit and the development of the quality system, all the personnel issues around people being qualified by training, education, and experience to perform their roles. The management review area is here. The two roles that are identified within the regulation, that of the manager with executive responsibility and a management representative, are also identified here. 820.30, which is design controls. Many of you know this area. It's one of my favorite areas. It's where I kind of grew up in my background is working in the design space for medical devices, and then document controls, purchasing controls. And then we move in out of those areas into into the production area. Production and process controls also within the scope of the quality system inspection technique. This is also the area for those of you that are in software validation, where software that is used in production or to support the quality system, meaning it automates any part of this 21 CFR Part 820 or other regulatory requirements that are associated with it. That validation requirement sets in the production and process controls area of the regulation. CAPA, corrective action and preventive action, is also in the current QSR, as well as product identification, packaging, labeling, handling, storage, distribution, records, installation. And then there's the records area, DMR and DHR, device master record and device history record. Notice in the previous slide, we had the design history file, the DHF. Keep those three abbreviations in your mind, because the rug's about to get pulled out from under those three ideas. Those three file types, those three record types are going to get a significant change in the new quality management system regulation. The complaint area is handled also within this records area, where it defines what's in a complaint, as well as service and statistical techniques. So that is how the current quality system regulation is structured, and that's what we're moving from. So what's about to happen to that structure? Well, first of all, from between 1996 and about 2018, nothing significant happened. There was the addition of the most significant thing that happened was probably just the addition of the requirement for UDI, the unique device identifier. But no real significant changes to the requirements, the mandates from the quality system regulation for all that time. So that was 20 years of no activity. Then in 2018, the FDA made an announcement that they were going to somehow blend or combine the requirements of the current QSR with those of the ISO 13485 standard, so that they might be better aligned with regulatory authorities around the globe. And so we all waited for that to happen. We were very excited about this possibility. Those that are living in both worlds now, who have products in the US under QSR and are also outside the US that are subject to 13485 requirements. But between 2018 and 2022, 5 times the FDA sent a deadline for the release of the proposed rule. Meaning that a rule that's subject to comment and is what they intend to put in place, but they want people to comment on it before they make final modifications and finalize the rule. And we saw nothing. But then in February of 2022, they finally published this proposed rule to amend 2 regulations, 21 CFR Part 820, which is the quality system regulation for medical devices, and 21 CFR Part 4, which is the regulation for combination products, combination drug device products, primarily because in that regulation Part 4, it makes reference to Part 820 requirements for those products that have both a device constituent and a drug constituent. And they sort of lay out, depending on your scenario and how your device is classified and who regulates it, which parts of 820 you have to follow. And obviously, if you're changing 820, all those references have to be updated. In March of 2022, so about really only just a week or two later, the FDA convened for the first time in I think over 10 or 15 years, the Device Good Manufacturing Practice Advisory Committee. And this was a public meeting where they presented to this committee, but the public was invited, and some comments were also made from industry representative groups to make recommendations regarding the proposed rule. I attended that meeting. It was very interesting, and it was interesting also to hear the viewpoints and concerns that several industry groups had regarding what they had already seen. That comment period to the proposed rule, where it was open for public comment from 23rd of February, closed on May 24th of 2022. And we've been waiting now for almost a year and a half for that all those comments to be absorbed and any final edits made, and for that to go to the next stage in the rulemaking process, all the reviews that it has to go through. before it becomes a final rule, and of course, as a final rule, a regulation that imposes its requirements upon the industry. So we'll talk a little bit more about what the timing of the release of that final rule might be in a moment, but that's where we are so far, and that's what's happening. One question you might ask, though, especially if you're not that familiar with ISO 1345, is why we would choose to sort of subsume or sublimate our regulation in the United States to this international standard. Why not have our own? Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, in understanding the ISO standard, initially created in 1996 as an adaptation of the ISO 9001 standard to the needs of the medical device industry, it is recognized by a wide variety of geographies. For those of you that do business outside the U.S., whether you're a U.S. firm that's doing business globally or you're a firm outside the U.S. shipping products inside the country, you know how ubiquitous the ISO 1345 standard is. It has been harmonized in the EU under the EU medical device regulation. In Canada, there is a requirement for ISO 1345 and MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program certification, or a corresponding CAM-to-CAS certification. Australia recognizes it, Japan, wide variety of countries recognize this standard. And its scope is similar to that as stated in the current quality system regulation, but it's a lot more explicit around being applicable to organizations that provide medical devices and related services. And the services piece of this sometimes is a little more murky in its application in 820. And also anyone that's outside of a manufacturer that's providing quality management system related services to these organizations that are within scope also have obligations under ISO 1345. And the reason FDA is interested in adopting this standard is because, first of all, the FDA helped write it. They were a key participant in 1996. It was and when it was initially released, they are continually involved, even to this day, in Technical Committee 210 through the ANSI organization. The FDA also participates in the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which is based on the 2016 version of ISO 1345, and actually accepts, as do several other countries, the MDSAP audit reports in lieu of routine FDA inspections. Now, they don't accept those for directed inspections or pre-market inspections, but if it's a routine audit or routine inspection, they'll take those instead of showing up at your site. And they stated in the preamble to this proposed rule, so that's all the material in the Federal Register. And if anybody's interested, we get into the Q&A, I can show you what that looks like. But the preamble often is as important in some ways as the actual rule or regulation itself, because it describes the FDA's reasoning as to why they wrote certain things within the regulation that they did. And in this case, in the proposed rule, they published this chart you see on the right-hand side of the slide that says why they think if the current quality system regulation and ISO 1345 are a good match. Because if you look at this, there are really only 4 areas where the FDA has said they see differences that they need to address. Document controls is one, labeling and packaging is another, records and servicing. And they address those in the proposed rule. But otherwise, most of the areas in the 1345 standard map pretty well to the current 820 regulation. Now, FDA does have statutory authority to make this kind of change on their own. In the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the act, the law, the statute in the United States that provides the FDA authority to do its work. I've cited here the part of that statute that says that the secretary, meaning the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is the governing secretariat or cabinet office under which the FDA operates, may prescribe regulations that requiring the methods used in the facility and facilities and controls used to manufacture, produce, and so on. So we have the statutory authority to make regulations, and they can change them going through the rulemaking process. And in the preamble to the proposed rule, the FDA says we're going to use that statutory authority that we already have to make the changes that we feel are necessary for Part 820 and Part 4. Within the proposed rule, what they say, the way that they align them is pretty drastic. In fact, it's more drastic than most of us that were anticipating the proposed rule thought it might be. Because what we have in essence, and we're going to go over very shortly, we're going to go over what the structure is and some interesting elements inside the proposed rule are. But they've stripped out almost all of the content of the current 21 CFR Part 820. The current quality system regulation looks nothing like it will when it's now the QMSR, the quality management system regulation. Instead of writing all of the different areas of 1345 that they agree with or they think are applicable into the quality system regulation, and they have instead adopted a principle called incorporate by reference. So they will put there's a statement within the proposed rule, and I'll show you where that is shortly, that simply says do everything 1345 says, unless we've clarified something where we want to alter that 1345 element, or we want to clarify something in it. And they have those additional definitions and requirements throughout the new QMSR, and those are actually pretty limited in terms of how much change they've adopted. One thing to note here is that by saying that they've adopted 1345, there are two other standards that go with it. One sort of by inference and one explicitly. So by inference, the ISO 14971 standard, which is the medical device risk management standard, also falls under an adoption of 1345. Now, nowhere in 1345 does it say you must adopt that standard. However, it does say that that when it's defining terms around risk management or talking about how risk management is adopted within a quality management system, they consistently reference the 14971 standard. So yes, you could adopt something else if you wanted, but it really needs to look a lot like 14971 if you're going to decide not to adopt that standard. You probably will be de facto anyway. Also, the definitions in the ISO 1345 standard are pretty brief for an ISO standard. And what they say within that definition section is the full set of definitions for all the terms that we would use or consider applicable are actually in ISO 9000. So if you go to ISO 9000, I believe it's the 2015 is the latest version of that. The definition section within that ISO standard is the definition section for 1345. So those two ISO standards accompany this one just by virtue of you adopting that ISO 1345 standard. So let's then look at what the structure is of the new proposed rule. And I'm going to point out some things that I think are interesting and might be worth just bringing up verbally. You'll notice I have some things highlighted. Those are the things I'm going to talk about. But there are also areas that you might find interesting I've not highlighted, and I won't talk about them necessarily, but they're there for your information. So when you get a copy of the slides, you'll have a lot more material than what I'm talking about, and I'll be focusing on these highlighted areas. So first of all, in the scope of 820, now 820.1, it says that if there's a conflict between 21 CFR Part 820 and ISO 1345, and Part 820 being how the FDA implements the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and its regulations, 820, 803, 806, 804, all the other ones that are there, will be the controlling regulations. So if we get into a situation where an FDA investigator says, I think you should do it this way because we feel the statutory authority is there to support that, or we feel that there is another regulation that might support what we expect you to do, and you point to an area in 1345 that may conflict with that, when it gets right down to it, they will side with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as the governing authority and overriding the 1345 area, 1345 statement. The next section is on definitions, and there are a few I want to draw your attention to. The first is one of my favorite words within the current quality system regulation is the word establish, which means within the 820.3 section currently is to define, document, and implement. And so throughout 820, when you see the FDA say you should establish a procedure or establish a document or establish a process, it means you define it, you document it, and you implement it. So just releasing a document's never enough. You must implement that procedure and execute it and provide objective evidence of that execution. And all of that together constitutes establishment of the process. Well, that term no longer exists. Quality Management System Regulation will now say that the 1345 term documented, which incorporates document and maintain, has effectively the same meaning, and so that's what the FDA will adopt. Next interesting thing I found here was that device master record is gone. For those of you that have gotten into argument, we're going to talk more about this in a few minutes because it's more than just the DMR that goes away. These other things are going to be a piece of history as well. But the DMR is getting removed in favor of the medical device file that is currently required by the ISO standard. So those of you that have struggled with, is it in the DMR, is it in the DHF? What's in the DMR? Do I have things properly tagged? That's no longer going to be a necessary element for you, especially if you're having to maintain the DMR in addition to a medical device file that's required by ISO 1345 and are trying to keep both of those straight. Now just focus on the medical device file. Neither the current Part 820 nor the ISO standard define the term customer, but it is now defined within the new QMSR. And it effectively is used to clarify who is impacted by the ISO requirements that talk about handling customer property. And so they've defined customer within the QMSR definition section. And finally here, the manufacturer and product definitions that are in the QMSR will be the definitions we adopt in the US in replacement of or instead of the definitions for those terms that are currently in the ISO standard. The current definition of manufacturer that we see in 820 will stay the same, but there is some difference in an update to the term product, which replaces this idea of manufacturing materials to instead talk about process agents. The next section is 820.7, and I don't have any comments there because that's the incorporation by reference section. This is where the standard says that you will be adopting 1345 unless there is something that clarifies or replaces those requirements within the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 820 here. And the section after that then talks about what those requirements are for a quality management system in 820.10. I found three things here that were really interesting to me. The first thing was that to make sure that although we're incorporating 1345 to replace 820, we still are obligated to also follow the other medical device related regulations that we constantly reference in other facets of FDA regulatory activity, which are Part 821. So some high-risk devices and devices of certain categories are required to have device tracking and have certain requirements on how they track those devices and what information they collect and communicate. Those will still be applicable. The 21 CFR Part 803 requirements for medical device reporting. For those of you outside the US, this is a vigilance reporting activity for adverse events or potential adverse events. And then 21 CFR Part 806 for corrections and removals. So this has to do with recalls and also obviously corrections or defect fixes that you might make in the field or removing a product from the market. All of these things are handled by Part 806. There are some reportability requirements in there as well. Those are all still in place, even with the adoption of the standard. There is also here in this QMS section a clarification of the scope of devices that are subject to 1345. which will clause 7.3, which is the new 820.30 for those of you very familiar with the current quality system regulations. So design controls is in 820.30 currently. This is equivalent to clause 7.3 within the ISO standard. These will include class 2 and 3 and certain class 1 devices. And that's an unchanged scope from what we have now, but it's quite different from many jurisdictions that also recognize 13485. And finally, this is in reference to the comment I made earlier. Any failure to comply with the regulations of Part 820 and by extension 13485 will render the device adulterated. And for those of you that watched the warning letters come up weekly from the FDA, or maybe have been unfortunate enough to be in an organization with a warning letter, all warning letters, when the FDA writes those, have this term in them. It says that because they have identified areas where you are out of compliance with the regulatory requirements, your product is deemed adulterated, and that's a direct extension or result of this statement that says that adulteration is a result of not following regulatory requirements. There's the clarification of concepts, section 820.15. You'll see a few here that I brought to note, but I want to talk about the control of records, which is the next section, 820.35, where they've added some signature requirements. And this got a lot of comments during the comment period, where there are signature requirements for a wider variety of documents than are currently required by the document controls within 820. And so many people thought this was an extra and undue burden. We'll see where that ends up in the final rule. And there are some content requirements specific to complaints, service records, and there are some clarifications on the UDI requirements, as well as, and similar to what we have in the current quality system regulation, a statement that, if you want to clarify to the FDA which documents you provide to them are confidential records, when they take records as a result of an inspection or other activities, you should do that. You should label those as confidential to clarify to the FDA what they should not share outside of the agency. The device labeling and packaging control section is the new 820.45. And it talks here about how the FDA feels that 1345 does not address labeling and packaging requirements sufficiently. And so they've added some into this section, including the requirement to do a review of those to make sure that they meet their specifications. So that's the structure of the proposed rule as it currently stands. A couple of things I wanted to add additionally that caught my attention that are sort of throughout the standard that are very different or strike a different note than what we see in the current regulation. The first one is that if you're familiar with the current quality system regulation, design validation only appears in one place. And that place is in 21 CFR 820.30G. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Risk management. Risk management only appears in one place in the current QSR, and that is in the design validation section. It's an odd place for it because, as we know, especially if we follow 14971, risk management is a life cycle long activity. Your initial inputs like FMEAs and maybe if you have cybersecurity issues, your threat models, they begin to form early on and they begin to feed risk management very early, as do intended uses, user needs, user requirements. And it goes all the way through the life cycle. And at the end of it all, you have a finalized risk analysis. You have all those mitigations in place. You have a risk management report. You have a risk benefit analysis. None of that is mentioned in the quality system regulation. And the only part risk management's ever mentioned is in this one spot as it relates to design validation, which we've always thought odd. And the FDA, trying to compensate for that, has recognized as a consensus standard ISO 14971 as a good way to implement risk management. And they obviously pay attention to risk management consistently throughout inspections and other enforcement activities. Well, the proposed incorporation of 1345 includes a definition for risk management that it then says comes from ISO 14971. So it creates a link with it. And then it also requires that you have a documented risk management process in 7.1 and in 8.2.1, the ISO standard says I got to feed back to risk management post-market. That's all brand new stuff. There is now a clear sense by following the ISO standard within the US requirements that risk management is full life cycle. And the FDA in their preamble to the regulation said clearly that they thought that the risk management elements within 1345 were a huge driver in why the FDA thought it important to align with that standard. The second thing here is what I alluded to earlier, which is the fact that the DMR, the device master record, the DHF, the design history file, and the DHR, the device history record, now cease to exist as distinct buckets of documents and items. They are going to be replaced by the document requirements that are in clause 4.2 of the standard and throughout the standard, as it tells you to create documents. And it has this new category, at least to those that are working exclusively in the US, of documents called a medical device file. I put this quote in here, which I found interesting. It says, "We're not proposing to retain separate requirements for these records, as we believe the elements that comprise those records are largely required to be documented by other ISO 1345 clauses, such as clause 4.2 and its subclauses." And that quote is out of the preamble to the proposed rule. So for those of you not familiar with these terms, a DHF, design history file, is the output of those design control activities within the DHF, but driving the manufacturing process and having all those manufacturing instructions and as well as specifications and other elements is the device master record. And then the device history record is a record that is created with each batch or with each device that is produced, showing that it was produced in compliance to the device master record and by extension the specifications in the design history file. Historically, especially the distinction between DMR and DHF has gotten so many people so confused and wrapped up in debates over what goes where. And now we can put to rest those debates. This distinction between these three elements goes completely away. What's going to happen next? Well, or how is this rollout going to happen? Well, as we talked about earlier, the comment period ended in May of 2022. So they will then proceed to incorporate and as I understand it, thousands of comments from various sources that were received into the proposed rule where they feel it's appropriate. They will make the edits to 21 CFR Part 4 as well for combination products. I have here that they will update the QSIT. This is the Quality System Inspection Technique, or the document that drives FDA investigators when they come into your site to do inspections, as I talked about before. I learned just last week, however, that it is more likely, and I'll use the words more likely instead of being more confident than that, just because that's the right thing to say at this time, that the QSIT guide will actually go away. Instead, a new document, a new inspection guideline will be written that will completely replace the current QSIT. There will also be a need to train the FDA staff. And in fact, some of the comments, and I was in the room with several people from the FDA and from industry this last week, earlier this week, actually. And some of the comments I got from FDA is, look, industry is going to be training us about 1345 because industry, or many companies within the medical device industry, are already implementing ISO 1345. And we in the FDA, although we're aware of it, and we have certain parts of the FDA in there that are focused on global harmonization, know about 1345 and are helping contribute to it. Our field investigators and our evaluators of product submissions, they don't know about this standard very much. They know very little about it. And they will be, in fact, learning from industry how ISO 1345 gets implemented and what the requirements really mean in practical terms as they're rolled out into a medical device program. So there will be a lot of training within the FDA for its staff, but post rollout, just be aware that it's still going to be very murky. They're going to be learning as we're learning how to deal with their new regulatory requirements in this area. There will also likely be updates to the medical device single audit program. As I told you before, that program is recognized by the FDA in lieu of routine inspections. But if you've been part of an MDSAP program, you know that in the audit policy to MDSAP, for each element, underneath that element, you will see some potentially country-specific requirements from Brazil or Australia or the United States or Canada or Japan. And they will have those requirements above and beyond or different than the normal MDSAP requirements. Well, because MDSAP is based on ISO 1345-2016, the number of US requirements is likely to be dropped to a very small number based on just the clarifications and changes that we see in the proposed rule that make it their way to the final rule. The final thing is that there's going to be a lot of reference document updates. And these are not just the references within, Part 4 to Part 820 and so on. But for those of you that have been in the industry for a while, especially if you've traveled from one type of medical device manufacturer to another, you're very well aware of the hundreds of guidance documents that exist for different product types, for different quality system element sort of drill downs. All of those have some reference to Part 820. All of those will have to be updated over time. So that's a Herculean affair that they have to go through to be able to get this ready. But once they've incorporated those comments and they're out of that proposed rule stage and they've got a final rule draft ready to go, they don't just publish it and send it out. Instead, it goes to the White House in the US, to an organization called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA. And OIRA does a review to look at interactions with other regulatory agencies to make sure it's consistent with statutory authorities that the regulatory agency has under law and a variety of other things. And where the FDA can control when they get their draft ready and out, they cannot control how long OIRA will sit on that document and review it. So Jeff Shuren, who is the director of the Center for Devices at the FDA and is ultimately responsible for this rewrite of 820, has committed in several presentations I've seen him do over the course of the last year and a half, that by December of this year, we will likely have a draft ready to go to OIRA. Now, obviously, if you're still stinging from the 4 or 5 missed deadlines that the FDA set for their proposed rule, you're kind of like, well, we'll just wait and see. But assuming they meet that December 2023 date, that's just the date it's going to OIRA. OIRA may keep it for a couple of weeks, or they may keep it for much, much longer. We have no idea. And OIRA does not publish when they're going to be finished with their review. They will simply put, and if anybody's interested, there is a web page you can go to with everything OIRA has in the docket, either things that I know are coming to them or things they already have that give you the status. And in the case, and there is already one set up for the QMSR, but once it gets into their offices, all they're going to say is it's under review, and that's all you'll see. But once they're done with their review, then they will release into the Federal Register, which is where all government documents go. And you can even subscribe to Federal Register releases that come from FDA. I do this, and it's how I get a bit of a advance notice of things that are coming out sometimes. But Federal Register is where this is published. They will publish the final rule and the preamble. Now, I will tell you, I strongly, strongly encourage everyone listening, when the final rule comes out, don't just read the regulation. Read the preamble. The preamble provides the rationale for why the FDA did what it did and said what it said. It will likely, as did the preamble to the 1997 Quality System Regulation, give you how they responded to industry questions and comments and why they did or did not address those in a certain way. And when you are in an inspection, you can expect that some of the logic that the investigators will use to hold you accountable to the regulation will have come from the preamble to the regulation, because again, it represents their rationale for why that language is there. So it's very important that you read the preamble, and I would say almost as important as the regulation itself, especially if you're in roles in your companies where you are in inspection management, having to defend your quality system. You will want to make sure that you understand what the investigator is going to come to you with in their mind. But after that final rule is released, there's going to be a transition period. The transition period that was proposed in the proposed rule was 1 year, where there would be some, sort of murky gray area where, things might be enforced in a different way than they will once it's final. They may or may not impose the final regulation on people, although we could follow it if you wanted during that period. Proposed is 1 year. A lot of people, and I'll admit I'm in the 1 year camp. I think 1 year is plenty of time. For large companies, you've already got 1345. It should be, one of these things you should be able to adapt. And I've been in very large companies, so I know the painful process it can be to make changes to the quality system regulation in large organizations. This can be done in a year, especially if you've already got a 1345 program in place. For small companies, you're likely more nimble. You can make changes more often to your quality system more easily. And as we saw before, there's already significant or substantial equivalence between the two, and the changes to your quality system will be moderate, but they shouldn't be severe. That being said, many in the industry, including some of the industry organizations that represent a wide variety of different companies, have asked for 2 years, and I know of one organization that actually asked for 4. So that transition period will have to be defined. We'll see what that definition is in the proposed rule. There will also likely be some transitional guidance. There was in 1997, where for that year or so that there was a transition period allowed for the original QSR, they said things like with design controls, which was a new thing for the QSR. It did not exist in the original GMP of 1978. We will identify deficiencies around design controls in inspections for this transition period, but we will not write a 483 observation against them. So those kinds of how we enforce something that might be applicable in one area but not another would be possibly in a transitional guidance. And so we may see some things there. We talked as well earlier about updates to QSIP. There's a compliance guides, other things that will go within the FDA that'll be there. And then after that transition period, full applicability. And at that point, the rule will be final, not only final, but now everyone will have to comply with it. So what are the impacts that we're going to see after all this is done to both industry and to the FDA? To the industry, when it regards QMS changes, again, in my view, if you are already 1345 certified, the changes to accommodate your to the quality management system regulation will be relatively minor. But if you're not currently certified, there may be significant changes, including an adoption of ISO 14971 for risk management if you've not already done that. The other thing industry has to deal with is access to the standard. If you're a small company with very limited budgets, every time you buy one of these standards for a few $100s, you feel it. And this is one of the reasons why all regulatory documents within the US are free. So how do we handle this now? And what did the FDA negotiate with the standards bodies around access? Well, first of all, you still can purchase. There's an ISO, you can see it on the ISO site, the ANSI site, or the AMI site. You can see these standards, and you can purchase them from those sites. There is also set up, again, as a concession to the FDA, a view-only version on the ANSI standards site where it's incorporated by reference, called IBR, incorporated by reference, standards available, ANSI.org. And when you get the slides, you'll see, you should be able to hopefully be able to click on that link and get right to that. You can't copy, you can't, select things and copy and paste. You can't print, you can't share, but you can view. So it has limited utility, but at least the FDA has here said, okay, we can't let you, these are for purchase. They cost money to create, money that these standards development organizations or SDOs want back. So we can't just give them away, but we can at least let you view them and then encourage you to buy them so you have copies of your own. Then there's this idea of what happens if I have a 1345 certificate already. Well, the FDA made clear in their preamble, number one, that when you pass an FDA inspection based on the QMSR, based on 1345, you will not get a 1345 certificate. The FDA has no intention of starting a 1345 certification program within its overall oversight. It's not going to be a notified body. So you would still have to have a notified body give you that certificate, which means that if you don't want to get certified at 1345, you don't have to. You would just be following it for the most part using the QMSR. Also, if you have a 1345 certificate, you're still subject to inspection by the FDA. The only exception would be for routine inspections if you're also part of MDSAP, which is also based on 1345. But just because you have a 1345 certificate, don't expect that it exempts you from any FDA inspection. Now, on the FDA side, what's the impact to them? Well, first of all, there's a lot of training required to OMDRO, which has within it the Office of Regulatory Affairs, and governs the divisions or the districts that then have the investigators that go out and inspect sites. They have a lot of training to go through there. It's going to be a significant effort. And as I said before, the FDA's actually said, we expect to learn as much from industry as anything else, in addition to our own training. Also, this is a big one, and I've kind of buried the lead here, but for those of you that have operated primarily within the US and have not had to deal with a notified body, you know clearly that the FDA does not look at management review minutes, internal audit reports, or supplier audit reports. It is a prohibition that it's a prohibition by regulation because of their own internal policy, not because of the statute. So they have the statutory authority to review those things, but they have chosen not to, in the hopes that it allows companies to be more open and honest in these three methods about where the issues are so that they can resolve them without fear that someone's looking over their shoulder as they sort of expose all of their dirty laundry. Well, in the 1345 world, as you know, if you already had that experience, or MDSAP, notified bodies do look at those kinds of records. So the question was, what will the FDA do? Will they remove this restriction? Will they start looking at these records? Or will they, in the final rule, exempt those from their review as they are currently? In the proposed rule, this exemption is gone. This restriction is gone, implying that they could indeed review those documents. So I still had this question in my mind. I was at a conference, a large conference early this year, where there was a panel of 4 or 5 people from FDA that were involved directly in the updates to the QMSR as a result of the comments. And they said almost explicitly that they would be removing this restriction. The FDA will start reviewing these documents, and that that these, as sort of behind the scenes things that are no longer open to their review, that restriction is now gone. So you'll have the same behavior, the same review of these documents from FDA as you have from the notified bodies if you've already had that experience. If you haven't had that experience of notified bodies before, then the FDA has been your only regulator, your only auditor, regulatory auditor. Then be prepared, get prepared. And does this mean that organizations might create shadow documents for solving problems? Well, we certainly hope not. It's obviously not the intent. However, it does make you think twice about what you put in these documents if you know you're getting oversight by an auditor. Again, if you're working with notified bodies, you've been doing this anyway, but the FDA not so much. And it does create quite a different dynamic in the inspection process. There are also, even though the FDA has had years of review, OIRA from the White House will do a regulatory review. There could still be some unknown statutory conflicts between what the regulation says and what the statute says, or what the way people may interpret what the statute says. And we will only know if those conflicts are there and are significant when people start to use it, when the FDA begins to enforce it, and when legal counsel from both the agency and from the company in question begin to come into conflict with one another over these interpretations. So we have no idea where these areas are going to be right now, but I never count out, especially in the early days of rollout, the potential that companies that find themselves under enforcement action from a requirement from 1345 that wasn't there before, that they may say, well, it may be in the standard, but it conflicts with the statute. And as you've already said in the preamble, the statute preempts anything that's in the standard. So those conflicts are likely to happen. We don't know where in the standard they might come to the surface, but be prepared, it could happen. Then there's finally this big area of managing the transition period. I think the winks and the nods that I've gotten from the people that I know in the agency are that there will likely be some transitional guidance similar to what we had in 1997. And the big questions that those transitional guidances will answer will be around how enforcement happens. If the FDA comes into my site and I would have an observation against a QMSR requirement or 1345 requirement that would not have been a problem under the current QSR, how is that treated? If I have a violation against the QSR, the current quality system regulation, that would not have been a violation or on the QMSR or 1345 side, how will that be handled during the transition period? So these are questions that nobody knows the real answers to yet, but as this transitional period evolves, and if there is transitional guidance, we would look for these questions to be answered. And I can tell you whether it's in transitional guidance or in the preamble or in some other form, these are top of mind for people that are in the inspectional areas within the FDA, in the enforcement areas. So you can expect the clarification on those points. So let me get back over here. That's all I had. That's my presentation for the day. I hope you got a good overview and enjoy for those of you that are old like me, enjoy the welcome back Cotter reference here in the last slide, but from the 70s. But hopefully this will give you some good insight on the proposed rule. And again, at the end, I see you're back on the camera. There's so much we don't know yet. And so hopefully we'll get a chance. I'm sure there was going to be more conferences and webinars and white papers than you can shake a stick out when this thing is released. But, I'm sure Greenlight Guru will be on top of that and provide some of their own insight as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And you already alluded to the possibility of maybe a part 2 in the spring. So I definitely think that's something that we need to pursue a little bit. Really appreciate it. That was a fantastic webinar. Not many people end within a minute of the of the allotted time. So fantastic. You're a true professional. Really appreciate it, Eric. Those of you listening, thank you so much for your participation in the chat. We're going to get to the Q&A in just a moment. First, I want to launch a survey. We are trying to tailor our future presentations to really meet your needs. So please take a minute to look at this survey and to answer this so that we can make sure that the content that we bring to you in the future is relevant and applicable to you. So I'm going to leave that open for just a moment, maybe 30 seconds or so, and then we're going to get into the Q&A. Hopefully you're seeing that.
I'll stop sharing so we can stop watching Horseshock.
Some people won't complain. We'll watch that all day.
Exactly.
All right. It's good to know. It looks like you've relaxed some people's thoughts about the upcoming changes, which is always a good thing. Okay. Thank you for your participation in the survey. I'm going to go ahead and close that out. We can go ahead and get into the Q&A. There were a lot of good questions. The one that was voted the most, with 34 votes, was from Bensing Wang. If I'm pronouncing your name correctly, what does FDA plan to do with Part 11 after moving to 1345? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Part 11 is not specific to medical devices. Part 11 was actually originally written for the pharmaceutical industry. And I'll tell you just a brief background so we don't get too deep into the Q&A for this with just this one topic, one question. But originally, because it was all paper-based, the submissions were all paper-based. And the reviews for drug applications were so extensive, literally a truck full of paper that had to be shipped to the FDA for every submission. It would take months and months for those reviews to happen, and sometimes more than a year. Well, patents only last so long. I think it's about 10 years. And so as soon as you submit a patent application, the clock is ticking. And every month that it takes the FDA to review is a month you're not selling and not recovering the research and development costs for that drug. So Part 11, and it had other purposes as well, but one of its big purposes was to streamline the review process by allowing electronic records to be submitted to the FDA. And it would improve and expedite the review process. But when FDA put that in place, what they said was, if it's a good idea for pharma, and by the way, the FDA doesn't do this very often. Those centers don't get along always very well. But they said, if it's good enough for pharma, it's good enough for everybody we regulate. So that Part 11 is actually applicable to all commodities FDA regulates: pharma, food, vet, medical devices, cosmetics, tobacco. It all subject to Part 11. So there should be no changes to Part 11 as an outcome of the QMSR implementation. It should stay as is.
Okay, fantastic. Appreciate the history there. That's really interesting. Okay, Naomi asked the question, if you're ISO 13485 certified, does that mean that if you don't have good manufacturing practice, that the FDA would recognize the ISO 13485 as appropriate?
So I think I understand the question. So these will no longer be called GMPs, right? It's just going to be the quality management system regulation. But one thing I don't want people to misunderstand, I said it in my next to the last slide. I tried to be clear that the FDA is not creating a certification program. So there will not be a quote QMSR certification. There will not be a 1345 certification that comes out of an FDA inspection to that regulation. It will simply be, are you or are you not compliant to the regulatory requirements in 820 and by extension and incorporated by reference 1345. If you are ISO 1345 certified, that really doesn't mean anything to the FDA. This is just where they're getting the content for their regulatory requirements. You will not be able to use that certificate in any way, at least as of now, to expect to not get an FDA inspection or to expedite the inspection or to reduce the scope of the inspection or any other benefit like that. You can just look at the ISO 1345 standard as the place where FDA gets its new content. The certification process really has no correlation to the regulation.
I think that's a good way to put it. So I appreciate you articulating it such. That's really good. Dan asked the question, any clarity from the FDA on how they will keep up with 1345 when it updates again?
That's the $1 million question right there.
Yeah.
And it's a really good one, Dan. And actually, that one should have got the most votes because it's one of the big open questions right now. As I understand it, they have gotten agreement from the ISO technical committees, and I think it's in 2026. I think is the next scheduled update. But my understanding, and don't quote me on this, even though this is being recorded, I guess that's kind of counterintuitive. But there's supposed to be an agreement that there will be no substantial changes to the standard in the 2026 update. to allow for a stabilization period, because the ISO standard only is up for review every 3 to 4 years, I think, or maybe it's 3 to 5 years. And I'm not on those committees, so I can't recall what the time frame is. Somebody who knows it in the chat can probably put that in there.
Yeah.
So the next one is actually not being viewed as a substantial change. And so it gives some stabilizing period. But that still doesn't answer the question, what happens when it does change? And the answer is, this is why it's not a certification program. Because it's the 2016 version that's simply providing the regulatory content for the standard, right? It's providing the language. I'm sorry. It's providing the language for the regulation. It's not a certification program. So what's going to happen is similar to what happened with the ISO standard they used in 1997, there will be over time a divergence from the current language in the QMSR to where the 1345 standard goes. And so that certification program may then over the years begin to deviate from where the FDA is with its current quality management system regulation. But the FDA, I think, is committed to, at appropriate intervals, and you and I both, any guess is as good a guess as any other as to what an appropriate interval is, will then go through the rulemaking process again to bring the QMSR back into alignment with the current version of 1345. But as we've already seen, just in getting the proposed rule out, and then to the final rule, and then to hopefully a rollout, that could be, let's say, let's assume 2018 is when they started, right? And let's say we have at best case a 1-year transition period starting at the best case release of the end of December of 2023. That's the end of 2024. That's a 6-year process to get the new version of the regulation out. So there will be divergence, even if there's later convergence. These two will over time begin to separate and will have to be brought back together again, or we will be brought back where we are today.
Yeah, the incorporation by reference, it's not referencing the year currently?
Yes, it is.
Is it?
Yes,
okay.
It is.
Yeah.
So it's the 1345 2016. They're very clear on that. In fact, during the public meeting that happened a couple of weeks after this was released, there was a request, and I either by AdvaMed or MDIC, where they said, can we just take the year out? And the guys in the FDA were like, well, absolutely not, because then there is no stable regulatory requirement, right? Yeah. They don't, and the training and the effort that you have to go through to build the government institutions around enforcing those regulatory requirements is just too great to be subject to those changes every few years under the ISO standard, under the technical committee.
Okay. Very, very interesting. I appreciate you going into the detail with that. I'm going to ask my own question just real quickly. A lot of these are somewhat duplicate, but I'm curious because I didn't see anything like this in the questions. How do you think FDA is going to address 43 observations during inspections during the transition period? For example, like if a violation of the QSR is not a violation of 1345 or vice versa.
Yeah, and that was kind of on my last slide too, because it's an impact. This is Eric's version of what, or view of what will happen. This is strictly my thoughts. I have some indications it's going to go this way, but nothing concrete, right? You will likely have transitional guidance similar to what we had in 1997. So you can get your hands on it still, but it's hard to find. Very, very hard to find. There was a transitional guidance built. It lasted for a year. It had a definite beginning and end date, and it made provisions for those kinds of circumstances. And so, for instance, in the GMPs of 1978, which the 1997 QSR replaced, there were no design controls. They were new in 1997. And so what the transitional guidance said was, if we find design controls deficiencies in an inspection during the transition period, we will identify those and bring them to the attention of the firm, but we will not write a 483 observation against them. And then at the end of the transition period, they would become observations if found. Okay. So I believe, I'm probably about 80 to 85% sure that we will have a transitional guidance that will have some of these circumstances identified, where if it's a violation of the QMSR or 1345, but not the QSR, here's what we're going to do. If it's the other way around, here's what we're going to do during that period. I would imagine it's going to allow maximum flexibility for industry to get acclimated to the new regulation. Likely they will bring to their attention where these divergences occur. My guess would be, and to guess again, if it's a violation of the QSR but not 1345, you'll get a 43 observation against it. If it's a violation of the QMSR but not the QSR, they will identify it but not cite you. That would be my guess is how that'll play out.
That makes logical sense. Okay, I appreciate you answering and indulging me. So let's go to Nadia's question. She asked, will FDA also be incorporating parts of the MDR as parts of the QSR chain, such as person responsible for regulatory compliance and the technical files?
Short answer to that, no.
Yeah.
No. In fact, the FDA, as most of us do that are looking at this at a global level, in fact, even at the True Quality Summit last year, we had a great speaker who brought, and I still keep it. I use this research report all the time. There was a great research report put out by UCLA and the Boston Consulting Group that was discussed at the Greenlight Guru's True Quality Summit last year, which stated that because of the complexity and the unpredictability and the poor rollout of the MDR, that the 10-year-ago landscape of regulatory submissions, which favored the EU over the US by an 80-20 ratio, is now completely reversed. It is 80-20 in favor of the US in terms of where companies have said they will go and submit first. So the FDA does not look at the EU MDR as a good example right now. They view that as overburdensome in some ways. There are some things that obviously I think people would say are good, but for instance, there's a lot of complaint right now about the 510K program and the lack of clinical evidence that the 510K program requires for new products. EU MDR cleaned the slate and said, everybody's got to have this evidence now. That would be a political nightmare in the US right now. So all the post-market requirements in the EU MDR are much more stringent, much more involved and laborious than they are in the US. But I don't know that the FDA sees those necessarily as good things right now. Some pieces of that may find their way in, but I don't see any wholesale copy paste of anything in the MDR coming into the QMSR.
Okay. I knew that it had flipped. I wasn't at that presentation, didn't realize it was 80-20. That's amazing.
It is a complete flip, 180, wow. 180 degrees.
Yeah. Okay, Ann Leonard asked the question, design controls listed in the QSR are based on classification and very limited for class 1 exempt devices. Will the QSR be increasing, I guess QMSR, be increasing D&D requirements to align with ISO?
No. In fact, in the preamble to the QMSR proposed rule, the scope of application is specifically design controls are mentioned as well, because that's a key place where there is a distinction or an exemption from where the classifications might exempt you out of the QSR. That will remain exactly as it is today. And in fact, the FDA went so far as to state that explicitly because 1345 is applicable to all classes, and the QMSR will not be. It will have the same exemptions and sort of graduated implementation that you see currently, based on class, based on device class.
Very, very cool. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so again, to your point, let's read the preamble.
Exactly. Well, it's important. I'm telling you, there is so much in there, and if you just read the regulation, you're missing half of the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Ann Leonard asked the question. She alludes to MDSAP. Any talk about FDA accepting ISO certificates in lieu of general inspection similar to MDSAP? I know you already answered that question. There's another question, though. This was the most voted highest, but another question about using or potentially moving from QSIT to something similar to the MDSAP. So, what are your thoughts on that? Either question.
So I'm glad you asked it that way, because that is news that is very fresh in my mind based on some discussions I had just this week. The quick answer to that question is, as we just said before, no. They will not be accepting ISO 1345 certificates, although MDSAP, based on 1345, FDA is an active participant, and as stated, they will accept those. However, although the new inspection program will not be QSIT, there will be a new inspection program. And I can tell you, although I don't know the degree to which this is true, that the current MDSAP audit policy document, that extensive long document that tells you what all the requirements are and how they should be inspected, and what the different country requirements are under each one, the big document that everybody maps to when they do their audits, that is providing significant input to the writing of the new inspection program. Now, I don't know to what degree that input is being taken, but it would be stupid to try to develop a compliance program from scratch around a standard for which a compliance program already exists. So that is being taken into consideration. It is being taken as input. And what's interesting here is at a certain level, the guy that runs the organization that is updating the QMSR also runs the organization that would be updating the inspection program guide. So there is management within the FDA that has visibility into both of these efforts to make sure that there is some harmonization.
Okay. Now that's helpful. I mean, to your point, if there's something in place, then, why are we going to reinvent the wheel? So it's interesting to think about that. But again, like you said, it's a bit speculation.
Right.
I appreciate where this one's coming from. Whoops, I may have just deleted it. Apologies, Karen. It's not deleted. It's just, it may have gotten marked as answered. Karen asked the question, can you give us the breakdown of the differences in EMDR, QMSR, and ISO 1345? I'm not going to ask you to do that necessarily.
That's a whole nother webinar.
but it's maybe that's something we can follow up with on a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, but I will tell you this, and I understand where the question is coming from, because 1345 is harmonized to EU MDR. It's the core component of MDSAP, and it will now be incorporated by reference in the QMSR. To the extent that 13485 is used to say that it meets certain requirements of EU MDR, those will be the same as they are in the US. Where the EU MDR goes beyond the 1345 requirements, those will not be requirements in the US. And I see no intention right now to go beyond those requirements other than the clarifications they've already made in the proposed rule.
That makes sense. Okay. Similar to part 820.45, the labeling, new requirements, and so forth.
Exactly. Packaging and labeling. Yep.
Okay. Sam asked the question, and I think this is a good one, but I want to add to it. So how will this transition alignment affect drug device combination products? There's another question that asks more pointedly about part 4. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit about that as well.
Sure can. So in part 4, especially where they're co-packaged, right? Combination products, there's a clear, and early on in part 4, there's a statement that says if you're packaged together and you are a drug with a device constituent, meaning that CBER, CDER, the Center for Drugs, is going to regulate you, then you follow all the 210-211 requirements. And here's a list of the 820 requirements you have to follow, right? If, however, you're a device with a drug constituent, meaning the Center for Devices will regulate you as primarily a device, then you're going to follow all the 820 requirements. And here's the list of 210-211 requirements that we want you to follow. That principle will stay the same. The only thing that is going to be changed is the references to the regulatory sections that you would have to follow, meaning that because it's incorporate by reference, instead of saying 820.30, and there is no 820. anything that's design controls, they're going to reference the ISO 13485 section that covers product development. And that would be one of the requirements you'd have to follow if you're a drug with a device constituent. So all of the requirements in terms of following, and I think it's on design controls and supplier controls and CAPA, and I can't remember all the others. If you're a drug with a device constituent, those requirements will stay the same. The only thing that will change is instead of referencing an 820 section, it'll reference a 1345 section.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a good breakdown. I think drug delivery combination products, I suppose, are a little bit of a mystery to a lot of people who haven't dabbled in that. But
yep,
and
they're becoming more and more, and they're becoming more and more common, especially as drug companies begin to add sort of technical overhead to their delivery mechanisms for those drugs. Right, those become more technically sophisticated and have more sort of structure around them and more functionality around them. This world of combination products is getting bigger and bigger.
Okay, this is not the highest voted question, but there were a lot of questions around DHR, DMR, DHF. And so
of course there are.
I figured I better just go ahead and give the most comprehensive one. Amir asks, can you expand on medical device replacement by DHR, DMR, DHF? Does it mean that one record encompassing all of those three would be considered as compliant to the new QMSR?
Yeah, so the best way to keep this in mind, the best way to think about this is DMR and DHF are gone, right? So the medical device file plus all of the requirements in product development and other area, all the other areas downstream through 1345, they just are, right? We're not going to label them anything. They just are. The DHR, however, would still exist as a record of production, not labeled DHR, but just as a record of all the production records that show that the product produced conformed to its requirements and specifications. So nothing's really changed in terms of the flow of documentation from requirements and specifications and verification validation through the creation of manufacturing instructions down to, did I manufacture this particular thing in conformance to those manufacturing instructions and by extension in compliance with the regulatory, with the specifications and requirements for the product. So that relationship, that flow doesn't change. We're just not labeling these things anymore. And
I appreciate you going through that. There was a lot of talk in the comments about that. So just that's something that we're going to have to wrap our heads around. And
it is, and I can still see the FDA investigators, lamenting during an inspection. Well, normally I would say it should be the DMR, but it's not. But I don't know what to call it. I mean, I can just see some of the old timers, because I work with a few of these ex-FDA guys in my firm, King and Spalding. That one of the guys, in fact, that works my firm, helped write with Kim Troutman, a guy named Bill O'Connell, helped write the QSR. Yeah. And he knows every section, subsection down to the letters by heart. And he is just agonizing over this adoption of 1345 because his baby is going away. And I could see him, he'll be 95 years old in a wheelchair, still talking about, how the DHR, the DHF, and the DMR should still be around. He doesn't know what to call them now. The documents aren't even there anymore. It's just, it's going to be a hard transition.
Yeah. And well, like you said, they're going to learn a lot from the industry as well. So it's going to be interesting. And so, like I said, we'll get together because I would love to have a follow-up in the spring. I'll make sure my team is actually on board with that. I'm sure they will be, but it's not my decision to make, but I think that would be fantastic. Those of you who've been asking in the chat, yes, we will give a link to the slides and a link to the presentation so that you should be able to go back and see the recording, the Q&A. I know we didn't get to all of the Q&A, so there's so many questions that we may have broken the record on number of questions asked. But we'll provide those to Eric. If he has time and is able to follow up with you with those, then he can do so. Feel free to follow up with him directly as well.
And I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to shoot me a note that way as well. And I try to be pretty responsive there.
Fantastic.